Chapter 12. Intercepted Ransom. "The hawk mustn't lose the pigeon," Joe cried, as the boys watched tensely. The peregrine poised for a second, then dived like a miniature rocket. Frank, Joe, and Chet ran across the field, their eyes still following the hawk. Suddenly, through a rift in the trees, they could see both birds. "The hawk got it," Frank exclaimed. A moment later, the two birds dropped to the woods. "Come on," Joe shouted and started running. When the boys did not immediately find the spot where the pigeon and hawk had fallen, they spread out and searched the bushes for some time, but without success. "Your falcon's got to be here someplace," Chet said. Just then they heard the wailing of a helicopter and hurried to the clearing where they could spot the craft. They saw Simon beckoning to them to follow. The boys nodded and moved along the edge of the woods, guided by their friend in the sky. Presently, he turned the craft and flew directly over the trees. Now Simon whirled up and then lowered quickly. Frank interpreted the maneuver. "He's trying to tell us where the bird is." Joe held out his gloved hand and whistled sharply. There was a movement in the bushes a few yards ahead of the boys. Then they spotted the peregrine falcon and her quarry. The young Hardys moved in slowly and picked up the falcon and the mangled pigeon. "This time she earned her meal," Joe said, spotting the telltale red container fastened to one of the pigeon's legs. Frank removed the capsule and opened it. As he shook it gently, two rubies fell out. "More of the ransom gems," he declared. Excitedly, the trio ran to the Morton's farm. The helicopter was still hovering ahead when they came out into the clearing, and Joe waved their thanks. Then the pilot headed for the airport to keep another appointment. When Frank and Joe reached their car, they said goodbye to Chet and drove home. After putting the falcon in the garage and setting the burglar alarm, the boys went into the house. A message was waiting for them to phone Jeff Kane. He had shadowed the captain and the crew members of the Daisy K and had investigated their reputations, but could find nothing suspicious in their activities. He learned that Captain Font ruled them with an iron hand, and they seemed to fear him. If anything crooked is going on in that gang," Frank said to Joe, "it's well concealed, that's for sure." Joe put through another call to Raymond Harper, who answered at once. When he told Mr. Harper that the Hardys had two important pieces of information from Mr. Delay, the reporter answered that Joe not reveal them on the phone. "I'll pass along your message," said Mr. Harper. "He'll probably fly up to Bayport sometime tonight. We'll be waiting for him." The Indian arrived about 8 o'clock, and he and the boys went into Mr. Hardy's study. As Mr. Delay settled himself in the chair, Frank unwrapped the two rubies and the ring, and explained how the Hardys had gotten them. Mr. Delay examined them, then finally said, I could almost swear that these are some of the ransom rubies. This poses a serious problem." He looked from one boy to the other, and they had felt that something had displeased him. "I do not want to seem ungrateful," said Mr. Delay, "but if these are part of the ransom, and are not received by the fiends who are holding Tarva, he may come to harm." Frank and Joe were thunderstruck. "I'm afraid we didn't realize that," Frank replied, "but we may be close enough to these kidnappers to catch them before they attempt anything." The Hardys told Mr. Delay about the goosehawk and the hunting lodge in the woods, and the possible flight of Tarva and his captors. Then Frank showed him the sandalwood scent box that Amid had found in the lodge. Tenderly, Delay cupped the box in his hand. "My friends," he said with emotion, "this is a box that was given to Tarva by his father at a ceremony. I myself witnessed it. May I keep it until Tarva is found?" "Of course," Frank replied. Mr. Delay asked, "You have someone watching this hunting lodge at all times?" The Hardys reassured him on this point. Then they concluded that the story of the man who had purchased carrier pigeons from Mr. Newton under the name Belknave. That's my real name," Delay exclaimed. "But not one of my relatives has been in this country." "We thought he was an impostor," Frank said. "What does this man look like?" Mr. Delay asked. "We were told he is tall, slender, handsome, about 25 years old. He has a prominent scar on his chin." The Indian weighed this information. His brow furrowed. Then he said, "The description sounds vaguely familiar. I shall speak to Raymond Harper about this. Perhaps he will recognize the man. In any case, I'm sure the impostor is an enemy." Joe changed the subject. "Does the name Ragu mean anything to you?" he asked. Mr. Delay thought over this, then said, "No. Can you describe him to me?" But the description of the swarthy, short, heavy-set man did not help. Frank said, "Ragu works here on a fishing boat called the Daisy K. Right now, though, he is in jail. We promised to go there tonight and prefer charges. Will you come with us and see if you know him?" "I shall be glad to," he said, "but I suggested, in case we should be followed, that we try to throw any pursuers off." Driving to police headquarters, Frank took every precaution to be sure that no one was trailing them. They learned, when they arrived, that Chief Colleague was at home for a late dinner, but would return in a few minutes. The sergeant on duty assisted them in filing charges against Ragu. When the Hardys explained the reason for Mr. Delly's presence, he looked at the collar. He took the collars to the cell where Ragu was being held. On the way, the sergeant said that the prisoner had been informed of his rights and refused a lawyer, and had admitted nothing. When Ragu saw the Hardys, he stared at them dolefully. He was about to say something, but suddenly he glanced up, and his eyes rested upon Mr. Delay. A look of awe and fright spread over his face as he staggered backwards. "Mr. Belknave?" he cried. Mr. Delay gazed at the prisoner, then said to the boys, "I do not know this man, but apparently he recognized me from newspaper photographs." Following up the advantage of the prisoner's surprise, Frank asked him whether he was ready to talk. Ragu did not answer. Just then Chief Colleague arrived. After the police chief was introduced to Mr. Belknave, the Hardys took the ransom rubies over to the officer for safekeeping. When Ragu saw the gems, he gasped, but made no comment. The police chief ordered the jailer to lock the cell door. They all went inside, forming an arc around the prisoner. They began to question him. Ragu remained defiant and uncooperative, but the Hardys felt that he was almost frightened enough to make a full confession. Chief Colleague asked him to explain the reason for the attempted theft of the Falcon, and the threats to Chet and the Hardys, he added. "And tell us all you know about the operations of the Daisy K." Again, the mention of Captain Font's ship had a visible effect on the first mate. Eyes widened, and he stared at Chief Colleague for a long moment. Then abruptly his shoulders sagged, and he looked at the floor. All further questions about Captain Font or the Daisy K aroused no response. Finally, Mr. Delay asked Ragu prompting questions about the smuggling of aliens from India into the United States, and more particularly about the kidnapping of Tarva. Ragu looked up, eyes flashing, and uttered one brief phrase in his native language. Mr. Delay nodded and turned to the other. "Ragu wishes to talk to me alone," he said. The boys and the police chief left the cell and waited at the end of the corridor. 10 minutes later, Mr. Delay called. When the others returned to the cell, Mr. Delay said, "Ragu has convinced me that he knows little, but he is willing to tell us that much."